Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning. Welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm Bob Sessions, retired philosophy professor. As always, economic issues are front and center in this election year. Both presidential candidates realize that many Americans are stressed about their economic security. Their analyses and solutions focus on globalization and job creation. Trump wants to cut taxes on the ruling class to stimulate job creation, and Clinton proposes an increase in government-sponsored work. They both oppose the Trans-Pacific Trade Pact being pushed by Obama. Neither of them, though, nor their fellow politicians down the ballot, pay much attention to what actually may be more important in the changing job scene, and that is automation. Think about it. 100 years or so ago, nearly 90% of Iowans worked on farms. Today, less than 2% do. Why? The mechanization of farming. The same thing has been happening in every sector of the economy. Law offices used to employ dozens of scribes to type each individual document. Now one person using a computer can do the work that used to require many. Robots are ubiquitous in factories, often replacing the majority of workers. Telephone operators are vague memories, and so on. But not only have most job types been changed, if not eliminated by automation, the speed of this change has accelerated to the point where some pundits are talking about an automation bomb. Today we will discuss this third wheel of our economy to gain a more complete and realistic perspective on what's happening with jobs and what our responses to this powerful force might be. We're very fortunate this morning to have three very capable and experienced pundits to help us wade through this tangled thicket. To my left is Greg VanSandt, who is the David W. Wilson Chair in Business Ethics at UNI. Next to him is Ben Hunnicutt, who is a professor of leisure studies at the University of Iowa, who for years, I know, has been working hard on this topic of leisure and work relationships. And finally, Peter Fisher, who is the research director at the Iowa Policy Project. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here this morning. Let's begin with your perspectives on the scope and the speed of automation in the workplace in the United States or around the world.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll start. I teach business, and it's no secret that business owners would much rather have robots in the factory than humans. Mm-hmm. They don't need vacations, they don't go to the bathroom, they don't go on strike. Machines make life a lot easier for managers in many ways. Mm-hmm. And I think this is just going to continue to get faster and faster.
Mm-hmm. Well, automation is not a new thing by any measure. It has been around for a couple of centuries. In the 19th century, I'm a historian, so my perspective is for the most part historical. In the 19th century, technology, automation was welcomed. Labor-saving devices were thought to bring progress. Mm-hmm. Higher wages and shorter hours. That sort of view has changed in the 20th century, so that automation has emerged as a threat, something that takes away our jobs rather than provides us with a richer life, a fuller life, more stuff, more time to enjoy the things that we are making. Now, for some reason, and this is what I've called in my classes the great leisure mystery, for some reason, we've changed our opinion about automation. We fear it's going to take away our jobs. I think I have an idea why this transformation occurred, but I'd just like to put it out there as a mystery. Why did it one time? We looked at automation as a great boon. Mm-hmm. Technology brings us more stuff, more time. Now we're talking about the threat.
Mm-hmm. Peter?
Well, yeah, just building on that, I think viewing automation as a problem, I mean, automation I guess I'd like to step back for a second. Automation is just one form of increasing labor productivity, which is historically the source of a rising standard of living. If we couldn't produce more per hour of labor, we'd still be living in caves and throwing spears. So productivity growth is essential to provide a foundation for rising prosperity, more leisure time, more purchasing power, more goods and services. The question is, where are those gains in productivity going to go? And to me, the problem of the last 20 years or so is that productivity has, actually longer than that, 30 or 40 years, wages have failed to keep pace with rising productivity, and that's the source of the problem of inequality. The gains from productivity, you're producing more value per hour of labor, but the laborer isn't getting it, people at the top are getting it.
Well, of course, and let's take the whole issue of foreign trade, okay? I mean, the great scapegoat is, well, all the jobs are going to China, et cetera. And of course, many manufacturing jobs did go to China or Bangladesh or Pakistan or wherever it might be. But one of the things that I've been reading is that actually there are a lot of new jobs being created with higher tech kinds of jobs. So that's not entirely it. But I think the mystery that Ben pointed to is really an important one to talk about, and that's the disconnect between people's standard of living and the increase in productivity that keeps going up. Or another way to put it, if you look at the graphs, the wealth keeps increasing almost exponentially over the last 40 years, and the income for middle Americans has stayed very stagnant for that 40 years.
Can I build on that, Bob?
Sure.
Not only have wages stagnated, but part of the great leisure mystery that I ask my classes about is that leisure time, having increased for over 100 years, working hours were cut virtually in half over what I've called the century of shorter hours, from 1820 to 1920 or so. And then they stabilize. After 1930, 1940, there has been no increase in short hours. In fact, since the mid-1970s, we're working longer, about 5 weeks per year longer now. Wages stabilized, hours have gotten longer, so that's why is this happening? Why is this disconnect? Why is this historical anomaly before us?
Well, let me put one part of this out. I think that one way of looking at it is that part of the rationale for how our system runs is that the people who put in the input, the effort and the resources and so on, should reap the benefits, right? Okay? And so if people are working the same number of hours, but productivity is going up because of automation, the people who own the automation, who buy the robots and so on, they're the ones who should get the profit. So it's that model of the connect between who gets the wealth and the effort that goes in. So the workers don't deserve it because they, after all, didn't buy the robots. Okay? So what do you think about that?
The employer is job creators, yes. Drives me crazy. Consumers are the job creators. They're the ones who are spending the money, creating the demand for the products. If it weren't for them, there wouldn't be any need for companies or workers.
And I think that's one of the fallacies of your argument. The only reason we produce things is so people can consume them. And to the extent that workers can't earn income, that reduces their ability to be consumers. There's an interesting book written several years ago, Martin Ford, it's called The Lights in the Tunnel, which makes that argument, that if we continue to concentrate wealth in fewer and fewer hands and machines do more and more work, pretty soon that system breaks down because there is no consumption available.
Henry Ford made the same sort of observation in the 1920s. He thought that he needed to pay workers enough so that they could buy his automobile. Otherwise, he wouldn't have a market. He would give them enough free time in order for them to use his automobile. So that sort of idea of wages and hours went together for years and years and years. Henry Ford was famous, at least for me he was famous, perhaps not anymore, but for saying free time will come because of automation. Free time will come. The only choice of modern people is unemployment or leisure. We've got to find some way of taking that time and using it in a useful way.
Let's come back to Iowa. Talked about farming and mechanization there. I mean, it's continuing apace. We were talking before about combines that are self-driving and planters that put the input into the fields because of connections to satellites, and farmers just have to get the machine down the field if they even do that anymore. And one person can do the work of dozens. In the fairly recent past. I mean, it's really continued. One way to look at that is, well, we don't need so many workers. Another way would be, well, gee, all this wealth is being produced, all this grain is being produced. You got all these people who are hungry, okay, for work and also, for enough wealth to live on. Why not spread the work around? Okay, so people wouldn't have to work so many hours. Is that idealistic?
It actually happened I'm always talking about the past, but it's a good example.
That's what historians
During
do.
the Great Depression, what I consider the salient political debate was share the work. The 30-hour bill was in Congress, the Black Connery bill, that just about passed. I think it would have changed the course of American history but it was co-opted by Fair Labor Standards Act, which establishes a 40-hour baseline. But the share of the work movement was at the heart of the politics of the Great Depression, and Herbert Hoover's term as well, just down the road.
I think there are two levels at which we need to address that question. One is at the individual level. How do I, who gain a large part of my self-identity as a college professor, if I don't have that work, how do I define my own value? And I think the other level of this is a societal level. Pretty much since, and I'm treading on your territory here with history, but pretty much since the beginning of time, as I understand it, we have organized our societies around gainful employment. And if we are truly at a place now where we don't need many people to do the work because it can all be done by machines, that puts an onus on society to start rethinking how we value members of society.
And not just value, but how do we provide people with the means of living?
Sure.
Yeah. Peter, did you have thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think that's the crucial question as a society, is to decide what we do with the gains from productivity. Is it all going to go to a few, or do we spread it around in terms of both work and leisure? And there are some people that have made these prognostications of the future and decided we need to have a class of people who don't work at all and guaranteed income, and the rest of us keep working 40, 50 hours a week. That doesn't appeal to me. I don't know why we don't have work sharing instead. But I also think it's important to keep it in perspective. I don't think this day is right around the corner, because if you look at productivity growth has slowed down in the last 15 years. It isn't picking up. It increased quite a bit in the 90s as a result of the introduction of the internet and computers and white-collar jobs. But since then, the problem has been slow productivity growth. So if robots are taking over our jobs, they're doing an awful slow job at it, because it should show up in productivity gains and in greater adoption of software and computer technologies that hasn't happened yet.
Are there places in the world where that hasn't happened? The productivity hasn't slowed down? That you're familiar with?
I think in some of the developing countries, that productivity is initially, making great gains.
In part because they're going through what we went through, years ago, right? I mean, they're catching
this
up.
idea of full-time work is a brand new idea. It comes out of the Roosevelt administration. The idea that working hours somehow will remain at 40 hours is a new thing. Before Roosevelt's administration, the 20s, people such as John Maynard Keynes fully expected technology would give us a 2.5-hour day by 1980. George Bernard Shaw, I got a whole list of this. So the idea that work is full-time, full employment, is a new idea. And the desperate efforts that we make as a government to assure everyone a full-time job has been the center of politics since Roosevelt's administration. That, I think, is in danger. That idea that everyone will have a full-time, meaningful job, I think, is a utopian dream that is not going to stand the test of time. It's going to be hard to sustain.
I ran across a quote that a Hungarian swimmer in the Olympics made. She said, "The problem is not the problem. The problem is your attitude towards the problem." And we're talking here about the threats that automation pose to employment. What if we looked at this as an opportunity to explore ways to expand our humanity?
Good point.
So suggestions for what that might mean. What's
Well,
your
I'm an educator.
idea?
I would make the argument that we should make much greater use of liberal education, liberal arts education, trying to help students explore the question of how they should live and what they love. University education has, in large part, become a technical training school for jobs. And that, I think, is the wrong direction.
It's an uphill battle, though, to reintroduce an idea that education, the liberal arts, are to teach people how to live rather than how to make a living. It's an uphill battle. One of my heroes, Robert Hutchins at the University of Chicago, the former president of the university, had that as his sort of central mission at the University of Chicago, and he was thrown out on his ear. So that idea is a hard sell. And being a professor of leisure studies, let me tell you, I don't get no respect.
Well,
it is a hard sell in a culture such as ours that puts such a great value on work, what Robert Hutchins calls salvation by work. I think that our concept of the job is something very near religious. It is the center of our being. It is where we live and move and have our being, and that's a new idea. It hasn't always been like that. This is brand new.
Well, and I speak as a business professor, probably as part of the problem, but I think you're right. People look to their work for meaning now, where they used to look to their family or to their religion. We've done something in our society.
Well, good luck on that one. What is it that a recent Harris poll shows that 70 to 75% of the people that they polled were not engaged at work. Over 50% were actively disengaged. They're not finding Prince Charming at their job, a job full of meaning, purpose, identity, and so forth. They're finding, the cartoon Dilbert? They're finding the pointy-headed boss, a place that is alienated, that is foreign, that doesn't provide meaning and purpose, but is something that, having jobs like that, going to school, I identify with that. As one of the women at Kellogg's told me when I was interviewing for my book about Kellogg's 6-hour day, she looked over, anybody but an idiot or a college professor knows that it's way better to be off work than have to go work. So I think that idea of a job with meaning and purpose and identity is fairly elitist.
Very much so. Yeah. I mean, more than half of the world has to work just to be able to put food on the table.
And the job is not a lot of fun.
Right.
Look, are you
Well-
going to get in here?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you view the problem as how do we share the gains from productivity increases through automation or other methods, how do we share those gains more broadly and equitably? If you look over the last 50 years, there's a number of problems. One is, stagnation of the minimum wage is certainly one policy that's been allowed to help inequality increase. But the other thing that's happened is a long secular decline in the share of the labor force that's represented by labor unions.
Yeah.
And you can track inequality across the country over time and state to state, and it increases where union representation decreases. And if you want to do something about inequality, one of the most important things you can do is figure out how to get national legislation passed for the first time in probably decades by now.
Since Taft-Hartley was outlawed.
Right, that increases the ability of unions to organize. The share of the workforce that's unionized is at an all-time low and continuing to go down.
Millennials, that's a big category in age group, and of course they're different depending on where they grew up in their educations and so on. But a lot of 20-somethings, let's call them, are not fooled by this idea that I'm going to have a job all my life. That's going to be the same job. They're ready to move every few years. They don't think they're going to find ultimate meaning in work. They're hoping to be able to spend as much time as possible doing fun activities, doing community activities, socializing, and so on. So I do think there is a big sector of that generation that is, without a lot of help from you and me, Ben, figuring it out, that something's wrong with that old story that their parents tried to live out.
They're interested in experiences over owning things or over having a good salary. Experiences rather than consuming material goods. There's a new economy aborning that's just on the horizon, the experience economy. That's really fascinating, something that I've just recently taken hold of and I've been reading about it. It's a wonderful thing. This is a new dimension of the economy coming after this manufacturing service. Now the experience economy, where people need both time and money to experience traveling, to experience a Build-A-Bear workshop. You need the time and the experience to have the experience. So you're right, the millennials are much more part of that.
I hope you're right. I really do. But every time I hear about what the millennial generation values, I think back to our generation. Most of us grew up, or all of us, I guess, grew up in the 60s, at some level there, and we were going to change the world. And we're the ones that we're arguing against now. Something happened between the 60s and today.
Things are the function of age then.
Well, it could be.
Well, the need for stability. And it seems to me that's another dimension we haven't talked about. And much of the reason why people are desperate for jobs and so on is because you have to have one and you have to have a lot of it in order to make enough to have a decent standard of living and so on. But a lot of that decent standard of living has to do with really community facilities. Roads and schools, and the list goes on. And I think healthcare should be one of those. Instead of spending so much by some individuals and other people not having it, a lot of employers would just as soon have universal health care, okay? That way they could do the job sharing thing because they don't have to pay that extra money out for the medical. That cost could be spread around. So it seems to me a lot of what we need to change is in those areas that are common facilities and common resources and so on that people are having to get individually, and therefore people are getting them very inequitably because they have different incomes and different access and so on.
I think there's another point to be made about our economic system and capitalism. There are all different flavors of capitalism. In the U.S., we have a very, very individualistic style of capitalism. If you go to the Scandinavian countries, it is much more a communitarian type of capitalism. And I don't know, you talk about difficult sells. I don't know how we would move the U.S. system of capitalism to a more communitarian style. But it sounds to me like that's the kind of thing you're describing.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think healthcare is our major example of where we could have done that. Public transportation is starting to happen, though, at least at local levels. We've got some pretty crummy systems between here and Chicago and so on, but there are places that are getting better transportation.
Hard
people are
sell
using
again.
Yeah.
We're in the middle of a political upheaval where government is the problem, as Ronald Reagan says. More and more people, a larger and larger percent of the voters believe that. And it's a hard sell to go the other direction.
We just have a couple minutes. The time goes so fast in this program. Why don't you each give me your sense of how you would like to see us go so that this automation revolution or bomb could be turned into something that was desirable, that people would really benefit from.
I think,
2 minutes.
Okay, I think it's a question that society needs to grapple with. This is not an individual thing that can be resolved at the individual level.
2 minutes. My last book, I hate to advertise my book, Free Time, The Forgotten American Dream. What I would like to see happen is the representation, the coming back of the old appreciation of what free time would offer us. A time for family, a time for community, a time for spiritual development. And if I can bring back people like Walt Whitman, Fannie Cohen, who were champions of free time, who saw in America's future a great flowering of civilization based on this new time. If I could represent those views, I think maybe that my work as a scholar would be successful.
Yeah.
I think a return of the idea of a work sharing or a new Fair Labor Standards Act, the redefined full-time work, is something that ought to be on the agenda, but the main thing is getting society to talk about this and to get out of the situation that we're in now, where we're stuck with the idea of a class of people working 40 hours a week and others without jobs or some other means of support. Those aren't by any means the only alternatives.
Yeah. Well, certainly it would help if we would, in our political dialogue, if you could call it that today, quit scapegoating, okay? It's not the Mexicans' faults, it's not the Chinese faults, it's not the Muslims' faults, and so on. We're part of a world economy, and we need to change, how we do that. Well, we could go on for a long time. This is a wonderful topic. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us for Ethical Perspectives on the News.